very warm welcome, Your Excellencies, ladies, gentlemen, friends, partners, colleagues, everyone. Welcome to the British Library, where I have the great pleasure of being Chief Executive, and welcome to a little bit of London that is forever Jaipur.
There is a sense of intense homecoming as we return, even though virtually, to JLF in London. It's been a huge privilege to partner with the British Library, and this collaboration has been so full of joy and learning.
It's a particular pleasure for me to come back to the British Library, which has been my office in London for many years, and where my books have all been written and researched, and it's very nice to see this end of my life sort of double back on it.
Our amazing writers, today more than any time, because of the way the digital age has taken over, we need you to be able to make sense of the past, divine the future, and perhaps set in context what we're going through at this very point of time.
This is the first time I've been to it in London. I've been to the one in Rajasthan before, and it's fantastic. It's got a different vibe here, but it's equally wonderful here.
JLF brings this amazing festival to London. It's a wonderful get-together of writers and thinkers, and you know, I only go to one festival, literature festival in the world, and it's this one.
The people who've been here, both bookshop customers, the authors and the organisers, have been an absolute delight to work with. I can honestly say as well that this is the best dressed, most elegantly dressed crowd at any literary festival I've ever seen anywhere.
It's maintained the standards which I'm accustomed to in Jaipur itself, and I'm extremely happy to be part of it here.
I love this festival. I think it's a privilege for me.
JLF deserves enormous congratulation for the way that it puts its program together here. I think that all of the events are superbly chaired. I think that the setting here in the British Library is just a fantastic environment.
Welcome you to JLF London 2020, presented in partnership with the Aga Khan Foundation and our patrons, the Murthy Family Foundation. Our magazine partner for this series is The Week, Journalism with a Human Touch. For those of you who are joining us today, I wish we were there to receive you in person, but our best laid plans have been put to rest, and even while London is occasionally sunny, we would have loved to be there with you, but we promise to be back in 2021. The arts have been impacted, as you all know, worldwide, and teamwork, we too have been hit very hard and have struggled to continue supporting all the work that we do. Please do consider donating to help JLF London at the British Library, which is free to view by clicking on the donation link below. Our next session today at JLF London 2020 is The Wall, John Lanchester in conversation with Akash Kapur. In a world fraught by climate change, political unrest, imagination, and a literal and figurative concrete barrier, John Lanchester's dystopian novel, The Wall, brings to us a timely tale of the inheritance of millennials and beats out stark realities almost to the point of discomfort. In conversation with Akash Kapur, Lanchester brings alive this world, which is no longer stranger than fiction, and speaks to us about his work, which interweaves the most compelling issues of our times into an uneasy tale of love, trust, and survival. John Lanchester's 5 novels and 4 works of nonfiction have won numerous prizes and have been translated into 30 languages and more, including The Debt to Pleasure, 1996, which won the 1996 Whitbread Book Award in the first novel category, the 1997 Hawthornden Prize. Mr. Phillips' Fragrant Harbour and Capital is some of his other work. Akash Kapur is the author of India Becoming, A Journey Through a Changing Landscape, which was named a Book of the Year by The New Yorker, The New Republic, and in Express, and an Editor's Choice by The New York Times. Our sessions, as you know, are available to view on london.jlflitfest.org and on our Facebook page, JLF Litfest, and on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. Please do remember to comment and ask questions by typing it into the comment section below, and John and Akash will be happy to take these at the end of the session. Ladies and gentlemen, The Wall, John Lanchester in conversation with Akash Kapur. John, I think Akash has sort of dropped off because of his bandwidth. So let me start by asking you a couple of questions. When you wrote The Wall, and we all know that while you haven't mentioned Trump at all, even for a second in the book, or what happened in America, or even Brexit for that matter, did you at all consider what was happening in the Middle East? As we know that much of what your book actually sets out to do is something that's already happening across in the Gaza Strip, and more so now in the West Bank.
One of the things that's, thanks Sanjay, so hello everybody. I wish you were here and I wish we were there together, but thanks for joining us. I tell you, the odd thing about this book, unlike anything else I've written, it had its origins in a dream. It sort of came fairly fully formed out of my unconscious. And this is in early 2016. I started having a recurring series of dreams in the sort of liminal state between sleep and wake. And it began with an image of a figure standing on a wall alone at night. And there was water on the other side of the wall, and this figure just standing there. And after I'd had the dream a few times, I started wondering who the person was, and then realized that actually in a way that was the wrong question, that the question I should be asking was what had happened, because it was clearly an altered world. It wasn't the reality we're living in. And that image really turned into the story of the book. I mean, it came very much out of my unconscious. And one of the things that's been odd is over the process of writing the book and then having it come out, is how many of the things in that dream image have sort of, it was clearly drawing on things that were happening in the world that I hadn't consciously been thinking about. If you asked me if I'd consciously been thinking about climate change, which is a huge thing in the book, or the Middle East, or this sort of great global phenomenon of us all turning away from each other, putting up walls, putting up barriers, I wouldn't have said that actually that they were consciously on my mind at all. But yeah, I mean, it's absolutely there in the book. I think, I was projecting forwards in two different ways in 2016. And I was thinking about the climate, the trajectory of the change in the climate, really continuing along the path that we have continued on. In the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the UN body that produces the main report, the central forecast, there's a band of probabilities for what will happen, and there's a band of what our responses might be which affect those outcomes. But this kind of central strip of that prediction is, I think it's 3.7 degrees centigrade of warming by the end of the century. And if you look at the map of the world with that amount of warming, it's a sort of unimaginable thing. Huge areas of the planet that are currently very densely settled become uninhabitable. And it implies, droughts, crop failures, floods, and mass migration on a scale the world has never seen. And so I was imagining us traveling along that trajectory. But the other trajectory was the one that's happened in our politics and our societies all across the world, which is this, I sometimes think if we were reading a history of the Roman Empire or something, it would be much more obvious what's happened, that we had this period of openness and connection and globalization and barriers and free movement and barriers coming down that has been followed by a kind of allergic reaction in the direction of walls going up, fortifications going up, us turning away from each other, societies turning inwards, people becoming more frightened, and political figures coming along who exploit that fear more. And to your point about the Middle East, one of the story I think we were telling ourselves about this period in history was about the end of the Cold War and the Berlin Wall coming down and the world opening up. But one of the bitter ironies is that we're living through one of the greatest epochs of wall building the world has ever seen. That since the Second World War, since 1945, most of the walls that have been built were built this century. The walls in the Middle East, Israel and Pakistan, Western Sahara and Morocco, Iraq is walled off from all its neighbours. We're living through a golden age of barriers being created, and as you say, the Middle East is one of the most potent of them. But it wasn't in my conscious head while I was writing the book.
John, Akash is back, so I'm going to hand over to him, and then I'll pop back up when he drops off. Akash,
thank you very much, Sanjay.
Okay, sorry about that, and I hope this lasts. So, John, I have a theory about this my sudden internet issue, which is you're well known as a tech dystopian, and the way I discovered your work was some of your essays in the LRB, where you take a fine knife to some of the tech companies. So I have a theory that this may be what's going on here. But be that as it may, let's talk about this book. And
if Zuckerberg will let us.
If they'll let us, right? I can't assure that this will last. I mean, I think if the internet companies were trying to torture us, they would bring me in and out, right? So we'll see.
Yeah, that's what would happen. Yeah.
I was going to say, the last time you and I spoke, we were on a stage together, a physical stage together at the Jaipur Lit Fest. And I was going to say that a lot has happened since then. And I was going to start off by asking you, how you've been and what have you been writing in that time?
Well, I haven't been writing as much as I might. I found it's been quite an interesting education in what the pandemic does, because my working life is the same. I'm sitting in a shed in my garden, which is where I work all the time. I have a book coming out quite soon. The publication process has been identical. The process of editing, proofreading, going through all the various stages, all that's identical. And my working life, I'd say my working life is as close to wholly unaltered as it's possible to get. And yet, I've found I've only been able to do about a third or half as much work as I normally would. And just because, while you're having issues with literal bandwidth there, there's a kind of metaphorical bandwidth thing to do with this extraordinary global development. I just find it getting in my head. And eventually what I did when I restarted work, I'd do half as much a day. I normally do a word count. So I just halved the word count. Because and I'm still doing that. I just can't, somehow part of my head, without consciously realizing it, part of my head has been taken up by these, the world pressing in on it.
Right.
So it's been an extremely strange period. I should say my wife and I both had coronavirus quite early on, which in some respects I think has made it easier, because it's made, that apprehension and anxiety on a personal level. I'm not frightened personally anymore, but it still is the case that this astonishing thing does really kind of get inside your brain.
Yeah, and I was thinking about it because, I mean, your writing and your fiction in particular is often said to be topical, and I, you know, this book certainly did feel topical to me. And I was thinking before I picked up the book, I was thinking, well, pretty dangerous to write a topical book right before the topic entirely changes and gets sort of swallowed up by one topic. But actually, I found it weirdly resonant still to sort of the COVID age, and I wanted to ask you both if you had a sense that, oh, my book's not going to be topical anymore, or how you see that actually.
I think that you have no control over it. I sometimes think that publishing a book is because the timescales are so long. You know, it's a thing that unless you've been through it, it's very hard to appreciate that it takes a book a year to come out. You know, when you ask people why, they can't really explain it. And I worked in publishing at one point. I can't really tell you why it takes a year, but the fact is it does. And so you don't have any control over the moment it comes out. You have no real sense of what the world's going to be like when your book lands. I sometimes think it's like those there are like cliff divers somewhere in Mexico in this very dangerous spot who have to jump off when the tide is out, because the tide comes in very abruptly, and they jump off, the tide comes in, they land in the water. Except, of course, when the tide doesn't come in, when they die horribly at the bottom of the cliff. And I think publishing a book is a lot like that, that you kind of jump off the cliff and you don't know where the water's going to be when the book lands. And when I started writing the book, Trump hadn't won the Republican nomination, and every pundit and sage in the world said that Brexit was certain not to happen. And leave alone things like, the global pandemic coming. So a whole set of things that were very unlikely in early 2016 have come into being in the course of writing and then publishing the book and then the book having its life. So it has been extremely strange. And given that it's quite a sort of dark, troubling story, it is a little bit like having had a nightmare and then gradually having elements of the nightmare come to life in the world around you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because to the extent the book, and I'll ask you about this, but to the extent the book was about global warming or something, that felt like a kind of a distant disaster scenario, and then the book comes to life in a current and present. I mean, some of the scenes of desolation in the book perfectly capture the mood of actual physical desolation that people have lived through in lockdowns over the past few months.
Yes, I mean that has been strange, and I did. This thing about turning away from each other, cutting off each other, isolation, confinement, separateness. It has sort of come to life in the world, and it's been strange the extent to which this period of sort of barriers going up between them. It's even the things like I support the wearing of masks. I wear one myself when I go out in public. But it's quite strange this sort of other reality we've slipped into. It's as if the world. It is like a fork in reality and us turning into an alternate timeline. I think our processing of this. I mean, the one thing getting through the pandemic in a practical way, getting out the other side when please soon there'll be a vaccine, things like that. But I think our mental processing of it, our sort of coming to terms with the emotional impact of it, I think that's going to be with us for many years.
Yeah. I wanted to know do you agree that your book is a topical book? And if yes, would you mind talking about what topics you were thinking of? And maybe you've already discussed this with Sanjoy before I came on, in which case we can move on.
No, I mentioned to Sanjoy, it wasn't in my head a topical thing. It came out of a series of dreams I was having about this figure standing on a wall. And then, in a sense, the story of the book was, trying to explain that image away to myself. I think if you'd asked me in 2016, what's on your mind, I wouldn't have said climate change and, you know, crises of globalization and things like that. But it was very much, you know, clearly on some unconscious level, I'd been brooding on it quite deeply. Because it did, you know, like no other book I've ever written, it emerged very fully formed. But I didn't think of it as, you know, a book. It's less, I suppose, how to put it. It's sort of, I thought as it were emerging from a topic rather than being about a topic, if you see what I mean. It emerged from this idea of a world fundamentally altered by catastrophic climate change. That's the premise of the book, I suppose. The thing that's been so odd is that how many of the political, you know, the movement towards separation, nationalism, division, things like that, how extraordinarily rapidly that's accelerated. Because, you know, in 2016, all the sensible people were still in power, you know, and we had this, you know, consensus that, you know, everything was normal, everything was fine, and now we're in this kind of much darker version of events.
Yeah. What do you mean when you say the novel emerged fully formed? Just briefly, I'm curious what you mean by that.
Well, yeah, I mentioned to Sanjay, you know, I had this image of this figure on the wall, and then I started thinking, well, who is he? And then realised that the real question was, well, what's happened? Because he's standing on a wall alone at night, and the water's on the other side. So I was like, okay. And well, the answer to what's happened, I realised, was it was catastrophic climate change. So they said, well, what's it like to be living in that world? Why is he standing on the wall? And the idea of, you know, it's an island nation, it's a version of Britain being sort of walled off. And the wall is partly to keep out the water. It's what in engineering they call a polder, you know, that sort of when the water on one level is higher than the land inside, and which sound unlikely, but in fact, you know, polders have been around for hundreds of years. And a third of the land surface of the Netherlands is actually below sea level, and it's a polder that keeps it out. The wall is partly a polder to keep the water out, and it's partly a fortification to stop people, poor, desperate people fleeing from troubled parts of the world, from getting into this country. And in the book, they're just called the others. They have no, they're not given any identity or substance or anything like that. And all of those, in a sense, they unfolded from the premise, you know, that this premise of catastrophic climate change and this walled off island. And as I said, that all came fairly fully formed. It was, as I say, image, person, and then the story kind of unfolds the world. You know, it was less like making something up. It was more like unpacking something. As I say, it's a strange process for me. I've not written a book like that before.
Right. Actually, I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned, you know, the others, and there are these various kind of like monikers or labels in the book. You know, there's the defenders, the breeders, the others, there's the wall. And I wanted to know what, you know, if you could talk about what you were thinking when you were doing that, what you were aiming at.
Well, I was thinking about, you know, as part of this process of unpacking what the world would be like, one of the answers that came to mind was that, you know, that 4-degree warmer world, the scale of the impact, the way it reaches, you know, it's global, it's societal, it's political, it's economic, it's also personal and psychological, would be like that of a world war. It would affect absolutely everything about how everyone in that society lived and felt. And that experience of global war, I think, involves a sense of people's lives contracting. They sort of become smaller, they shrink around essentials, around sort of things that you have to do to survive. And there's a kind of contraction or a shrinking in the language as well, that things become more monotone, things become simpler, plainer, more focused on sort of bare essentials. And so one of the things I try to capture that in the tone of the book and in the language of the book, you know, that see things in terms of breeders, others, defenders. It's very kind of, it's quite stark, it's quite monochromatic, because life is quite stark and quite monochromatic. And as I say, I wanted that to be something that was sort of in the world and also in the texture of their lives and the texture of their language.
Right. And I mean, that actually, it's another sort of question of mine. One of the dangers, of course, of topical fiction or idea-driven fiction is that everything becomes a vessel for a theme and becomes an idea. And I was happy to see the love story in your novel. I mean, it really fleshed it out for me, right? It turned it from a novel of, let's say, complemented the novel of ideas component of the book. And I wondered if you could talk about, I was wondering if you did that deliberately, or just more generally what some of the difficulties are of writing novel of ideas, because I think this is a novel of ideas.
I think I think the single biggest risk really of a novel ideas is that you can explain all the ideas. And if you can explain everything in a book or in an imaginary world, I mean, it goes for all works of fiction, movies too, you can slightly explain it away. You can end up with...
Do you mean by explain, sorry to interrupt, but do you mean by explain that there are no questions left, or what exactly do you mean by explaining?
I do, that there are no questions left, that there are no uncertainties left, that there's a sort of algebraic relationship between what the idea is and the way the idea is expressed is. That there's sort of too direct a correlation between, I think intention, the risk is that authorial intention is just too obvious. What the author wants you to think is, and that any work really in any form where that is too clear is slightly lifeless, in my opinion. That you have to have, there has to be freedom for the reader to think different, freedom from the reader to sort of disagree with the writer. Even inside that imaginary world. On the point about the relationships, the person who lived the most dramatic version of global crisis that I know was my grandmother, who was my grandparents lived in Hong Kong, and they were interned when the Japanese invaded. So they spent the war in internment camp, concentration camp. And they were for 4 years, 3 years, 9 months. And my grandfather never recovered, died before I was born, but my grandmother did, and I knew her well, and she would sometimes talk about the camp. And partly that thing about the importance of, that kind of slight narrowing of life, and the thing about survival, a focus on survival involving a kind of, as I say, monochrome, shrunk down, sort of black and white, sort of like a tunnel vision on the fundamentals of survival. That came from her. That was something she talked about. But the other thing she talked about was that even in these extreme circumstances of being in this internment camp where people died of starvation, people were, one of her best friends was executed by the Japanese for having a radio. And even in that kind of really extreme, unprecedented version of life, that people are still people. People still had relationships. There were still, people you got on really well with, people you were really annoyed by. There were still petty irritations. There was still the ebb and flow of relationships, even in really extreme circumstances, was really important, because we're human beings. That's what we do. We connect with each other. We have relationships with each other. We're all about the back and forth of human feeling. And I really wanted to have in the book something, that human reality was very strongly present, as well as the intensity of this altered world. But within that altered world, people are still people, and they still have their feelings.
Yeah, and I think it came out really well, and I think those private moments, as it were, set a very nice contrast to the monochromeness or whatever of public life. I think we're going to take questions soon, so I just wanted to ask you, move on to something. You mentioned, and I understand that you have a new book coming out, and I think it's fiction, and I wanted to know, is it similarly kind of topical? Is it what type of fiction is it? What are you writing about?
Well, it's in one way it couldn't be more different, because it's a book of ghost stories. It's called Reality and Other Stories, and it started with I was staying with a friend over New Year's one year, and wanted to do something to thank them for their hospitality. So I wrote a ghost story based on the idea of being at a house party. They're at a house party. There's someone that no one's ever properly introduced to each other, and this is a spoiler alert, which is going to ruin one of the stories for everyone. But and then one of the people that there actually isn't a person; they're a ghost. You realise at the end of the story, and I wrote it. It was the first short story I'd ever written, and then an immensely validating thing happened, which was the New Yorker took it. It was published in the New Yorker, and I sort of felt, sometimes that you get a prompt from the universe, and having written this ghost story and had it published in the New Yorker, okay, well I'll write another ghost story, and so I had another idea that about 6 months later and wrote that, and then it sort of happened a few more times. It's slightly like when I was a teenager, I used to write poetry. Really, really bad poetry, all of which now, unfortunately, no longer exists in the world. Thank you. But I remember the thing about writing even very, very bad poetry was that you couldn't sort of choose to do it. It sort of slightly came to you. Mm-hmm. And the thing about these stories, a novel is quite a lot of conscious work. And as someone once said, it's slightly like building a bridge. There's lots of choices you have to make. You have to keep going back day after day after day. But the thing about the stories was that they sort of slightly came to me. They had, it's like a premise would come, and then sometimes there'd be a slight delay, and then the way of doing it would come. Here's the idea. Here's how to do it, and then I'd write the story, often in just a few days. And then after a year or two of that, it turned out I had 8 of them. I had enough to do a book, and really towards the end of the process, I suddenly realized that all the stories had something in common, which is all of them had a central role for mobile phone. And I realized actually that it's much clearer now than it was in my head at the time, that there's a thing in them about the kind of uncanniness of mobile phones. I think there's something there's something magical and otherworldly about the fact that we can connect with anyone in the world at any time, anywhere. We can have any piece of information we want, anytime, anywhere. And I think it's almost inadvertently we've slipped over into a kind of parallel realm that, it's like there's a piece of magic living with us in our ordinary world. And I realized after I'd written this book of stories that it's actually partly, writing about phones and writing about ghosts and magic are sort of weirdly alike.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that you could say that about a lot of technology, right? Including what we're doing now. I mean, is it Carl Sagan, or maybe not Carl Sagan? Somebody refers to technology as magic, right? I mean, there's a famous quote about that.
Arthur C. Clarke. Yeah.
Arthur C. Clarke.
Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.
Right. That's
I do absolutely. And there's a very interesting thing. Edward O. Wilson, the American biologist and sociobiologist, said that in a way the problem of modern life is that we have Paleolithic mental equipment. We're the same people we were when we were emerging from the African savannah 200,000 years ago. And the overwhelming majority of human history is lived by people with Paleolithic consciousnesses. We have medieval institutions in our society, and we have godlike technology.
Right.
And I think that's a very accurate way of putting the strangeness of the modern moment in
That's
one
great.
formulation, this disconnect.
I like it. That's sort of like it's an accentuation of the problem that evolutionary biology has been studying for decades, which is the disconnect between our minds and our bodies. But now it's sort of gone to a whole different level. It's like basically the mind runs ahead of the biology and keeps lapping it, right? Keeps going.
Yeah, it does. And I think, you know, one of, I mean, this thing we're doing now is magic.
Mm-hmm.
It is a piece of the future that's sort of fallen into the present. And I think there is some way in which our emotions, our understanding haven't quite caught up with where we are. You know, we are, in a bizarre way, we're living in the future. We're living in a version of the future, even in the present.
Mm-hmm. John, I have a question. I have a question for you.
Yeah.
From an audience member. Rohit Datta asks, he says, many people tend to see fields such as writing or the arts and technology or economics as two distinct ends of the spectrum. However, your career has shown this isn't the case. How would you say the two influence and interact with each other?
Well, I got very interested in, I think, as in the course of my work, I got increasingly interested in what's the thing behind the thing. So there's often an obvious story, you know, and then there's a story behind the story, a story of explanation, a story of as you know, the metaphor I sometimes use is what's inside the box. What's the thing you're not seeing that is strongly present, and that led me towards an interest in economics. And it led me partly through, I wanted to write a novel about London, but came out as Capital eventually. And I got very interested in the question of just the changes in the street where I live, in the place around where I am, and realized that I didn't really understand that unless I started thinking about economics, because that affected, not in a metaphorical way, it literally was who my neighbours were. There were people who worked in economics and finance, and that was a change that happened, you know, over the previous 10 years or so. And so it was that interest in, you know, sort of deep causal phenomena that led me to make that connection. I mean, to Rohit's question, though, I think a lot of artists and writers do find it deeply antithetical, and I do understand why. And it touches on the thing about, in a way, it's a little bit like your question, Akash, about explanation, about ideas, that you can explain things away. You know, the idea of explanation, you can find it empowering, and I must admit, I do draw energy from it, but at the same time, economics sometimes explains things too completely. Is the reason for that is, and then it sort of shuts the conversation down. And I think I'm in a minority, actually, of finding those things stimulating, as opposed to in the artistic world, I mean, as opposed to finding it a sort of way of cutting the conversation off. I think that's why so many artists are deeply opposed to economic thinking.
Right. Although, on the other hand, as you say, it's so much part of life and the human experience, particularly maybe in the modern world, that it feels hard to imagine writing about human life without writing about these things. But let me move on to another question. Sanya Kumari asks, given your experience in journalism, much of your writing has, of course, been based on and inspired by the lives of others. However, your other works, including your memoir, Family Romance, draws inspiration from your own experiences. How do you believe these two processes intertwine, and how do they differ?
I think, you know, if you're writers, almost by definition, believe in stories. You know, if you're not deeply committed to the idea of stories as meaningful ways of processing the world, understanding the world, coming to terms with the world and understanding yourself, you don't write. You know, to be a writer is to have a belief in the importance and the kind of human usefulness of stories. And I think your own life is a story, really. You know, I think certainly for a writer, it's very difficult to live. I mean, there are people who do live without a kind of narrative of themselves. I think in some respects they're quite close to saints or mystics to live without a narrative. But I do, you know, I don't, in a sense, I don't see a distinction between what happens to me as a topic to write about and, you know, what happens to you or something I read in a book. They're all things that you can make sense of by turning them into a story.
Right. Okay, I think we might have one or two more questions. Let me go through them. Here's another question. Shrey Mittal asks, how do you feel your multicultural background has contributed to your ability to tell stories?
I think it's a really good question. I think a big part of it was we moved around a lot when I was a kid. My mother was Irish, and my father had a kind of, you know, his passport said he was British, but he was born in Africa. He grew up mainly in Hong Kong. He was evacuated to Australia when the war broke out, and so he was educated in Australia. And then he spent his whole working life in Asia. He lived in Kolkata for a bit, as I did when I was a kid, and then in Burma, Malaya, Borneo, and then mainly Hong Kong. And we moved around. You know, I was born in Hamburg in Germany because my father's employer sent him there because he spoke German. We then moved to Hong Kong, we then moved to Kolkata, we then moved to Borneo, we then moved back to Hong Kong. And I think the thing that had a big effect on me being a writer was partly that displacement. Every writer I know has an element of displacement or dislocation, and it can be psychological, it can be gender-based, it can be sexuality, it can be class, it can be a temperamental question, but there's always an element of being slightly out of place. And I think mine was partly that sort of geographical dislocation and moving around. And I think the other thing that was crucial to becoming a writer was that the thing that I had in common in all those places was the language. That, you know, these are very, very different countries, very, very different cultures, a lot of experience of otherness, other kinds of people. But the common thread was that the language moved with the family. And I think part of what wired me up to be a writer was that experience of, in a way, there's that saying that home isn't the thing that you leave behind. Home is the thing you take with you. Mm-hmm. I always found that a rather beautiful idea. And certainly from my childhood, the thing that was home was language.
So you mean that the fact that language was something you could hold on to for all these dislocations?
Yes, I think that's right. I think that it became, very important as a kind of common thread, really.
Right. Understand. Ujwal asks, in your writing process, how much of the crafting character comes from real life interactions?
Not much once I get going, but some of the starting points do. There's a thing, Henry James, the great Anglo-American novelist, had this very, very annoying habit when people started telling him, if you told him a really interesting story, he'd quite often stop you at a particular point. And he said, no, thank you. That he didn't want to know what had happened in real life, but he just liked the idea of the prompt. Must have been incredibly annoying. Imagine that, you're launching into one of your best stories, you're kind of building towards the punchline, and Henry James suddenly says, dear boy, I think, I've got enough, thank you. But certainly in my own case, I don't think I've ever directly appropriated a real person and put him in a book, but I've quite often stolen predicaments or ideas or a kind of what would happen if. I quite often take those from things I see or hear or observe. That real people don't fit that well in books, because real people have so many contradictions and ragged edges. You know, you almost always have to, essentially, you have to simplify and leave things out in order to squeeze a piece of reality into a book.
Yeah,
it's more about leaving out than it is about putting in.
Yeah, there's a funny thing. I once saw Michael Ondaatje talk, and he said, you know, you can put stranger, more contradictory things in nonfiction than you can in fiction, because when you put it in fiction, everybody accuses you of being implausible, whereas in nonfiction, it's just reality.
It's completely true, and it's one of the reasons I write both. Because one of the things that you cannot do, I mean, Ondaatje is completely right. One of the things that you can't do in fiction, you can do anything. There's a John Updike novel where the characters swap race and gender halfway through, you know, and it works fine. You can do absolutely anything, but you can't write about things that are, you can write about magic, but you can't write about things that are unlikely.
Right.
You know, and sort of the problem is that life is full of unlikely things. Unlikely things happen all the time. But if you put them in a book, in a work of fiction, it breaks them, because fiction has to feel true, whereas life doesn't have to fit. Life doesn't have to feel true, and it doesn't.
And fiction has to be rounded and kind of closed off, whereas in nonfiction, something doesn't add up. The answer is, well, it's real. It doesn't add up, right? I mean, nonfiction writers often say good nonfiction writing shows its seams. It has to show its seams, or it's not real nonfiction.
Absolutely. The example I used to give was when I was published by Penguin. Penguin was just down the road. So I've dropped my ear. Penguin is just down the road from.
I think we've had a timeout here. Why don't you just finish the thought, and then why don't you just finish the thought?
Sure. And from the Strand, from the Savoy Hotel, which has the only public road in England where it's compulsory to drive on the right, because you have to go in on the right to turn around. Now, in a novel, that I think that's a wonderful fact. But if you made it up, it would be really boring and stupid. You know, why would you make up a dumb thing like that? It's only interesting because it's true.
Right. That's funny. Okay, John, I think I'm done, and I'm going to hand over to Sanjoy to wrap up here. It was really nice talking to you.
Thank you very much, Akash. Look forward to meeting in person next time.
Thank you so much, Akash, for popping back up. That was magic in many different ways, and thank you, John. And the one question that I had actually was, you know, the sheer boredom of your character, Kavanagh, as he sort of traversed this wall, trying to keep people out and sort of looking into the mist and the darkness, as opposed to just receiving and engaging with people, is such a wonderful visual of what this keeping out sort of stands for in many different ways. So thank you for the wall, and thank you for joining us. And I wish we could have done this in person like we did at the Jaipur Literature Festival, but hey, we can't. We'll have to wait for that for another year. Thank you all for watching.
Thank you so much.
And thank you all for being such a fabulous audience. And of course, we'd like to thank all our partners, the British Library, the Aga Khan Foundation, and our patron, the Murthy Family Foundation, for their support. Please do also stay logged on for our next session, The Lost Children, presenting Deepa Annapara in conversation. We now present a short reading from the Jaipur Writer Shorts featuring writer Abir Mukherjee. But before that, do consider donating to help us bridge the financial gap for JLF London at the British Library, which is free to view by clicking on the link below. And please also do support the British Library by donating to them at support.pl.uk/donate. The Jaipur Writer Shorts, Abir Mukherjee is a wonderful storyteller, and we have a short reading from him. Before that, I need to also thank the Kamini and Vindi Banga Family Trust and Pratham Books and Save the Children, who are excited to announce the launch of Kahani Online, our new platform for storytelling for children. It's a unique portal that celebrates the magic of storytelling and all its forms, from music and dance to theater, puppetry, science, and so much more, with every a fresh episode week on week featuring storytellers from across the world. Kahani Online has been curated specially for young people. So please do visit that on kahanifestival.com for an exclusive preview, free for this particular 1 month period. And now, ladies and gentlemen, for a reading by Abir Mukherjee as part of Jaipur Writer Shorts.
Hi, I'm Abir Mukherjee, and I'm going to read you a small extract from the start of my latest novel, Death in the East. February 1922, Jatinga, Assam. The birds were killing themselves. Not a few, but thousands. They're starlings, said the woman. Suicide birds. The voice of a long-dead schoolmaster echoed inside my skull. You, Wyndham, the collective noun for a flock of starlings is... My ignorance was met by the crack of ruler on desk. Murmuration, boy. A flock of starlings is called a murmuration. Now don't forget. Murmuration. It suggested the clandestine. Something whispered, something hidden. Maybe it had to do with the way they flew. Vast flocks pirouetting through the clouds as though of one mind, receiving instructions from one voice. And tonight, in the void of a new moon, did that voice tell them to plummet earthward through mountain mists and to break themselves on the floor of this valley in the middle of nowhere? I leaned on the veranda's wooden balustrade and watched. In the valley below, the flames from 100 torches illuminated a scene from Dante as half-naked tribesmen shrieked and ran and set about the fallen creatures with clubs and sticks. Why do they do it? I asked. The woman turned to me, her expression suddenly sombre. Fear, she said. The same reason men the world over attack anything they don't understand. I meant the birds, I said. Why do they come here to die? She smiled. Everyone has to die somewhere. And personally, Captain, I can't think of a better place, can you? She looked down at the tribesmen. Of course, the locals believe the valley is cursed, that the birds become possessed by evil spirits. And you, I asked, what do you believe? Me? She feigned surprise, a pretense for my benefit, then moved closer. When she spoke, her voice was a whisper. If you decide to stay in our little outpost for a length of time, Captain, you may find a fair few of our number who are possessed of a certain malevolence. Who's to say there isn't evil at work here? The cries from the valley floor started to ebb, and the air began to still, no longer roiled by the constant swoop and smack of birds crashing to their deaths. Behind us, a door opened. Yellow light spilled onto the velvet blackness of the veranda. A starched servant in a white tunic and stiff fanned turban made the call to dinner, then stood aside as the sahibs and mems of the Jatinga Club downed drinks and processed inside. Emily Carter took a final sip from her flute. Brace yourself, Captain, she said. This is where the fun starts. She handed the empty glass to the servant and disappeared inside, though not before kicking the blood-stained bird off the balcony and away into the darkness below. Thank you.